Some people are treated as invisible their entire lives. Their worth judged only by what others decide they're missing. Lira knew this pain better than anyone born without a voice in a world that valued only those who could speak. Every day. In the cold castle, she scrubbed floors and mended clothes while enduring beatings for mistakes she couldn't explain. But Lira had a secret gift. With needle and thread, she created beautiful tapestries that told stories her voice never could. When the scarred Prince Calder returned home after years away, he found one of her abandoned works. The embroidery was so full of emotion and beauty that it took his breath away. In this harsh place, someone had created something extraordinary. Who was this mystery person with such talent? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountain kingdom of Drakmor had always been a place where winter lingered too long and warmth came too rarely. Built into the gray cliffs that scraped the belly of storm clouds, the castle stood like a weathered monument to endurance rather than glory. Its stones had darkened over centuries, stained by rain and time, and its corridors echoed with the kind of cold that settled deep in one's bones and never quite left. 17-year-old. Lira moved through these corridors like a ghost learning to haunt. Her bare feet made no sound against the warm stone floors as she carried heavy buckets of water up narrow servant stairs, her slight frame bending under burdens that would challenge grown men. She had learned long ago that silence was survival, not just because she couldn't speak, but because drawing attention in this place meant inviting cruelty. The worn leather pouch at her waist held her most precious possessions, a collection of needles inherited from a mother she barely remembered, and threads in colors that seemed impossibly bright against the castle's relentless gray. The pouch had belonged to her mother, one of the few things that survived the fever that took both her parents when Lira was barely old enough to understand what death meant. Inside, wrapped in a piece of faded silk, lay needles of different sizes and threads spun from materials she couldn't name, some as fine as spider silk, others thick as rope, in shades of crimson and gold and deep forest green. Matron Grell ruled the servants' quarters with the kind of iron discipline that broke spirits before it shaped them, a woman of sharp angles and sharper words. She had grown bitter through decades of service to nobles who treated her barely better than she treated those beneath her. Her gray hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features into a permanent scowl, and her hands, red and raw from years of scrubbing, were always ready to deliver punishment for the smallest infractions. "Girl," Matron Grell's voice cracked like a whip down the hallway. "Those chamber pots won't empty themselves, and if I find so much as a speck of dust on Lord Vex's windowsill, you'll be scrubbing the kitchen stones until your fingers bleed." Lira ducked her head in acknowledgement, her dark hair falling like a curtain across her face. She had learned to make herself small, to move quickly and efficiently through her tasks, while avoiding the direct gaze of anyone who might find fault with her work. The other servants had long since stopped trying to include her in their whispered conversations or shared complaints. What was the point of speaking to someone who couldn't answer? But they were wrong about her silence meaning emptiness. In the hidden alcoves of the castle, in forgotten rooms where dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight, Lira created worlds with her needle and thread. She embroidered stories onto scraps of fabric she found or stole tales of brave knights and distant kingdoms, of love that conquered cruelty, of voices that sang so beautifully they could heal broken hearts. Each stitch was a word she couldn't speak, each pattern a song she couldn't sing. The castle's kitchens provided her only refuge from the constant hostility. Cook Marta, a round woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted aprons, had taken a protective interest in Lira from the day she arrived as a frightened child. Marta couldn't undo the cruelty Lira faced elsewhere, but she could ensure the girl never went hungry and always had a warm place to sit when the work was done. "Eat, child," Marta would say, pressing a bowl of hearty stew into Lyra's hands. "You're nothing but bones and determination, and that's not enough to keep a person going." Marta understood that Lyra's silence wasn't defiance or stupidity, as others claimed. She saw the intelligence in the girl's dark eyes, the way Lira absorbed everything around her and responded with subtle gestures that spoke volumes to those who bothered to look. When Marta's arthritis made kneading difficult, Lyra's small hands would take over the bread-making with an intuitive understanding of timing and texture. When the kitchen fire burned too hot, Lira would adjust the dampers without being asked, reading the flames like others read words on a page. The castle's noble residents barely acknowledged Lyra's existence, except when they needed someone to blame for life's small inconveniences. Lord Vex, the king's chief advisor, was particularly cruel in his casual dismissal of her humanity. A man who wore his authority like expensive cologne too much and applied without thought for others. He delighted in finding fault with servants who couldn't defend themselves. "The mute girl," he would say, as if she were a broken piece of furniture rather than a person. "I don't know why we keep such useless creatures around. She can't even explain herself when things go wrong." Princess Seraphina, the king's niece, was gentler but no less distant, beautiful in the way that came from a lifetime of careful tending. She moved through the castle like a swan gliding across still water, graceful, admired, and completely separate from the messier realities of those who served her. She wasn't cruel, but her kindness was abstract, the sort that felt good to give but cost nothing to bestow. For 30 years, Prince Calder had been absent from these halls, and the castle had learned to function around the empty space his exile had left behind. The second son of the late king, he had once been expected to serve as his brother's trusted advisor and military commander. But childhood tragedy had scarred him in ways that went deeper than flesh, and shame had driven him to seek solitude in the wild places beyond the kingdom's borders. The accident had happened when Calder was only 12. A stable fire, started by his own carelessness with a lantern, had trapped him inside with 3 of the kingdom's finest war horses. By the time help arrived, 2 animals were dead, and Calder's face bore burns that no amount of healing could fully erase. The physical scars were only part of the damage. The guilt of causing the deaths of beloved animals, the whispers that followed him through the halls, the way people's eyes would dart away when they looked at him, all of it had combined to convince him that he was a creature better suited to shadows than sunlight. King Aldric had grown harder in his brother's absence. The elder son who had inherited a crown, he sometimes wore like a burden. Aldric ruled with the kind of stern practicality that kept kingdoms functioning, but rarely made them flourish. He loved his brother, but couldn't understand the self-imposed exile that had deprived him of his closest ally. Letters went unanswered, invitations were declined, and eventually, even the king had stopped reaching out across the silence. But exile changes a man. And the Prince Calder who returned to Drakmor after 3 decades was not the broken boy who had fled. Years of solitude had taught him to see beauty in imperfection, to find strength in vulnerability, and to recognize worth in places others overlooked. His face still bore the marks of old fire, his left cheek scarred with raised ridges. That spoke of pain endured and survived, but his eyes held a depth that came from looking inward long enough to understand what truly mattered. He had returned, not because his wounds had healed, but because word had reached him of threats gathering beyond the kingdom's borders. Whatever personal shame he carried, he couldn't ignore his duty when his homeland faced danger. The kingdom needed every capable defender, and Calder had spent his exile learning to fight with the kind of desperate skill that came from protecting himself in wild places, where weakness meant death. The castle buzzed with nervous energy in the days following his arrival. Servants whispered about the scarred prince who walked the halls at odd hours, exploring rooms that had been empty for decades. Nobles debated whether his return meant the king was preparing for war or simply growing sentimental in his advancing years. But no one knew what to make of Calder himself, a man who carried himself with quiet dignity despite his disfigurement, who spoke little but observed everything, who seemed to be searching for something in the familiar corridors of his childhood. Political tensions had been building for months beyond the castle walls. The neighboring kingdom of Valeria had grown aggressive under new leadership, testing Drakmore's border defenses and making diplomatic demands that sounded more like threats. Trade routes that had been secure for generations now required armed escorts, and refugees from contested border villages brought stories of burned farms and missing people. Lord Vex advocated for a strong military response, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had never personally swung a sword in anger. He spoke of honor and strength, of teaching Valeria's upstart nobles the cost of challenging an established kingdom. But King Aldrich remembered too well the price of the last war, fought when his father was young and he himself was barely more than a child. Wars consumed gold and lives with equal hunger, and Drakmore's treasury was not what it once had been. The castle itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for decisions that would shape the kingdom's future. In the great hall, maps were spread across ancient tables while advisors pointed and argued about supply lines and defensive positions. In the armory, weapons that had gathered dust for years were cleaned and sharpened. In the servants' quarters, everyone worked a little faster and spoke a little quieter, sensing that change was coming, whether they welcomed it or not. Through all of this, Lira moved like water finding its level around obstacles, through narrow spaces, always flowing toward the hidden places where she could create beauty in a world determined to convince her she had no value. She didn't know that her quiet artistry was about to intersect with forces much larger than herself, or that the scarred prince wandering the castle's forgotten corners was searching for exactly the kind of truth her needlework revealed. In the deepest part of the castle, where storage rooms held the accumulated debris of centuries, an abandoned tapestry frame held a piece of fabric that would change everything. Lira had been working on it for months, stealing moments between tasks to add stitches that told the story of a servant girl who dreamed of a world where kindness mattered more than power. She didn't know that tomorrow someone would find her, work and recognize in it the voice she had never been able to speak aloud. The crystal goblet shattered against the stone floor like a small explosion of light and sound, each fragment catching the morning sun that streamed through the high windows of Lord Vex's chambers. Lyra's heart stopped for the space of 3 heartbeats as she stared at the destruction, knowing with absolute certainty that no one would believe the truth, that the goblet had simply slipped from the polished tray, wet from condensation. She hadn't noticed. Clumsy mute. Matron Grell's voice filled the room like thunder, her face flushing the deep red that always preceded her worst rages. That goblet was worth more than you'll earn in 10 lifetimes. You worthless creature. Lira dropped to her knees immediately, her hands moving frantically to gather the scattered pieces. She could feel the sharp edges cutting into her palms, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the growing dread in her chest. She tried to signal with her hands to show that it had been an accident, but Matron Grell was beyond reason. Don't you dare try to make excuses with your hand-waving nonsense. The older woman grabbed a fistful of Lyra's dark hair, yanking her head back with vicious force. You think because you can't speak, you can't be held responsible for your actions. You think your silence makes you special? The first blow came across Lyra's cheek, hard enough to send stars dancing across her vision. The second caught her shoulder as she tried to protect her face, and the third drove the air from her lungs as Matron Grell's knee connected with her ribs. Each strike felt like punishment, not just for the broken goblet, but for every moment of Lyra's existence that had somehow offended the natural order of things. Stupid, worthless, burden of a girl. Each word was punctuated by another blow. We should have left you on the mountainside when you were small, saved everyone the trouble of feeding a creature that contributes nothing but broken things and silence." When the beating finally stopped, Lira lay curled on the floor among the crystal fragments, her body a map of new pain drawn over the faded marks of old injuries. Matron Grell stood over her, breathing heavily from the exertion, her gray hair now hanging loose around her face. "Clean this mess," she spat, "and if I find a single piece of crystal left behind, you'll spend the night in the cellar with the rats. Maybe they'll appreciate your company more than the rest of us do." Alone in the chamber, Lira slowly pulled herself upright, each movement sending fresh waves of pain through her bruised ribs. She gathered the crystal pieces with shaking hands, grateful that at least this time the injuries were hidden beneath her rough servant's dress. The worst beatings were the ones that left marks others could see, because then she would endure not just pain, but also the whispered comments about her clumsiness and the pitying looks that somehow felt worse than outright cruelty. When the chamber was spotless and every glinting fragment had been swept away, Lira made her way through the castle's winding corridors toward the only place that offered any measure of comfort. Deep in the castle's foundation, where the original builders had carved storage rooms from the living rock, there was a forgotten space that had become her sanctuary. Years ago, she had discovered a room that held nothing but broken furniture and discarded tapestries, a place so far from the main corridors that even the other servants never ventured there. She slipped through a doorway, barely wide enough for her slight frame, and into the familiar embrace of her secret world. Here, dusty sunbeams filtered through a crack in the stone wall, providing just enough light to work by. Here, she had arranged a nest of old cushions and faded blankets, creating a space that felt like home in a way nowhere else ever had. With trembling fingers, Lira reached into her leather pouch and withdrew a clean piece of linen she had been saving for something special. The fabric was fine enough to embroider delicate details, white as fresh snow and soft as hope. She selected a needle and began to thread it with colors that matched her pain-deep purples for the bruises blooming on her skin, angry reds for the cuts on her palms, and dark grays for the despair that threatened to overwhelm her dot as her needle moved through the fabric. Lira began to tell her story in the only language she possessed. She stitched the outline of a castle built from thorns, its windows like empty eyes staring down at a small figure kneeling among scattered stars. She embroidered tears that fell upward instead of down, defying gravity in the way she wished her spirit could defy the weight of her circumstances. She created flowers growing from cracks in stone, their petals bright against the darkness, each one a small rebellion against the cruelty that surrounded her. The work soothed her in ways that words never could. Each stitch was deliberate, purposeful, a tiny act of creation in a world that seemed determined to destroy everything beautiful. She embroidered her pain but also her resilience, her loneliness but also her hope, weaving together a story that spoke of survival and the quiet strength that bloomed in hidden places. Hours passed as she worked, the handkerchief growing more intricate with each passing moment. She added tiny figures in the corners, a kitchen maid with kind eyes who might have been meant to represent Cook Marta, a prince with a scarred face who existed only in her imagination, a servant girl whose hands glowed with golden thread, transforming everything she touched. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside made her freeze, needle poised halfway through a delicate stitch. No one ever came to this part of the castle. The footsteps were measured, deliberate, belonging to someone who walked with authority rather than haste. Lira quickly pulled a dusty cloth over her work and pressed herself back against the stone wall, hoping the shadows would hide her. Prince Calder paused in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the dim corridor light. He had been exploring the castle's forgotten spaces, reacquainting himself with the home he had abandoned so many years ago. Each room held memories, some sweet, others bitter, and he found himself drawn to the places where time seemed to have stopped, where the weight of royal expectation couldn't follow. He stepped into the room slowly, his eyes adjusting to the filtered light. What he saw made him catch his breath. In the corner, barely visible in the shadows, a young woman sat among a nest of old fabrics, her dark hair falling like a curtain around her face. She was so still she might have been carved from stone, but there was something in her posture that spoke of fear rather than stillness. His gaze fell to her hands, and he saw the fresh cuts across her palms, the blood still bright against her pale skin. Without thinking, he took a step closer, his heart clenching with unexpected protectiveness. This was clearly a servant, probably someone who had been caught in some minor infraction and punished for it. He had seen such things countless times before his exile, but somehow this felt different. Then he noticed the handkerchief clutched in her bloodied hands, and what he saw made him forget about protocol and propriety entirely. The embroidery work was exquisite, more beautiful than anything he had seen in the finest courts of neighboring kingdoms. But it wasn't just the technical skill that captured his attention. It was the raw emotion woven into every stitch, the story of pain and resilience that spoke to something deep in his own scarred soul. Lira raised her eyes to meet his, and for a moment, neither of them moved. She had never seen him this close. Before, the prince who had returned from exile, bearing scars that marked him as different, as damaged in ways that others whispered about but never openly discussed. His left cheek bore the raised ridges of old burns, but his eyes held a gentleness that made her think of deep forests and quiet streams. Calder saw, in her gaze, an intelligence that had been overlooked, a spirit that had been beaten but not broken. He saw the fear that made her press back against the wall, but also the defiance that kept her chin raised despite her obvious pain. Most of all, he saw in her bloodied hands and the extraordinary work they had created an artistry that spoke truths he had spent years learning to recognize. Neither of them spoke, she because she couldn't, he because words seemed inadequate for the moment. Instead, he reached slowly into his vest and withdrew a clean linen handkerchief of his own, embroidered with his family's crest in silver thread. He placed it gently on the floor between them, his eyes never leaving hers, then backed away toward the door. Just before he left, he paused and looked back. "Your work," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion, "is the most beautiful thing I have seen in 30 years. Then he was gone, leaving only the faint echo of footsteps and the lingering scent of leather and pine. Lira stared at the handkerchief he had left behind, her heart racing with confusion and something that might have been hope. She reached for the fabric with trembling fingers, noting the fine quality of the linen and the masterful embroidery work that marked it as belonging to royalty. For the first time in her 17 years of life, someone had seen her work and called it beautiful. Someone had looked past her silence and her servant's dress and seen something worthy of acknowledgement. As she traced the silver threads of the royal crest with one finger, Lira felt something shift inside her chest, a tiny crack in the armor of despair she had built around her heart. She didn't know that upstairs, Prince Calder was sitting in his chambers, staring at the blood-stained handkerchief he had taken from her hiding place, his own hands shaking as he traced the extraordinary embroidery that told a story of suffering transformed into art. She didn't know that for the first time since his return, he felt a purpose beyond duty calling to him. All she knew was that someone had seen her, truly seen her, and found her worthy of beauty. 3 days passed before Lira found the courage to return to her hidden sanctuary. The bruises from Matron. Grell's beating had settled into deep purples and yellows that painted a painful story across her ribs and shoulders, and each breath reminded her of her vulnerability in this harsh place. But stronger than the fear of discovery was her need to understand what had happened in that dusty room, to make sense of the moment when a prince had looked at her work and called it beautiful. She slipped through the narrow doorway like a shadow, seeking its source, her heart hammering against her bruised ribs. The room appeared exactly as she had left it. Dusty sunbeams still filtering through the crack in the stone wall. Her nest of old cushions undisturbed in the corner. But there, where Prince Calder had placed his handkerchief, something extraordinary waited for her. The royal handkerchief remained, but it had been transformed. Woven through the silver threads of the family crest were new strands fine silver. Wire so delicate it seemed to catch light from the air itself. The wire had been worked into the existing embroidery with a skill that spoke of patience and reverence, creating patterns that seemed to dance around the original design, like music made visible. Lira picked up the handkerchief with trembling fingers, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. This wasn't just a gift. It was a response, an answer to her wordless story, written in a language she understood better than speech. Someone had taken her work seriously enough to add to it. To participate in the conversation, her needle had begun. Wrapped within the folds of the handkerchief, she found a small coil of the same silver wire, enough to work with for hours. Silver was precious beyond imagining for someone like her, worth more than she could earn in years of service. Yet here it was, given freely to a mute servant girl whose existence barely registered in the minds of most nobles. She sat among her cushions for a long time, studying the way the silver wire caught the filtered light, marveling at how it transformed the entire piece. The original embroidery had been beautiful, but the addition of the wire elevated it to something almost magical. It was as if someone had understood not just the technical skill of her work, but the emotion behind it, the desperate need to create beauty in a world that offered so little. That evening, after her regular tasks were completed and the castle had settled into its nightly rhythms, Lira found herself working by candlelight in her sanctuary. She had begun a new piece, this one more ambitious than anything she had attempted before. Using the silver wire sparingly but effectively, she created the outline of a castle that looked suspiciously like Drakmore, but transformed by her imagination into something kinder. In her embroidered castle, the windows glowed with warm light instead of staring like empty eyes. Gardens bloomed where real stone courtyards lay bare, and figures moved through the halls with purpose and joy rather than fear and haste. She stitched a great hall where servants and nobles sat together at long tables, sharing meals and stories as equals. She created chambers where art covered the walls and music filled the air, where beauty was valued as much as power. At the center of her imagined castle, she embroidered two figures standing together on a balcony overlooking the transformed kingdom. One bore the subtle suggestion of scars, worked in silver thread that caught the light like wisdom earned through suffering. The other was small and dark-haired, her hands glowing with golden thread as she created tapestries that hung like banners throughout the castle. The work absorbed her completely, each stitch a word in a conversation she was having with someone she had never properly met but somehow understood. She found herself wondering about the prince who had discovered her hiding place, who had seen past her silence to recognize the voice her needle gave her. In the few glimpses she had caught of him in the corridors, he had seemed different from the other nobles, quieter, more thoughtful, carrying himself with the kind of dignity that came from accepting rather than hiding one's imperfections. Over the following weeks, a pattern developed that felt like magic in a place where magic was usually the province of fear rather than wonder. Lira would leave her work in the hidden room, and by the next evening, she would find responses, sometimes small gifts like colored threads or tiny silver charms, sometimes written notes in an elegant hand that she was learning to recognize. The notes were revelations to her. She had learned to read from the prayer books in the castle's chapel, teaching herself to connect the symbols with meanings through patient observation and careful listening when the priest gave sermons. But these notes were different. They spoke directly to her, acknowledging her intelligence and treating her thoughts as worthy of response. "Your castle of dreams," read one note, left alongside a skein of golden thread, "reminds me that hope is not foolishness, but courage. In your stitches, I see a vision of what could be rather than what is. Another note, wrapped around a small collection of pearls, so tiny they look like tears made solid, said simply, "Beauty shared is beauty multiplied." Your art makes me remember why creating something lasting matters more than accumulating something temporary. Lira found herself composing responses in embroidery, working late into the night by candlelight to create images that would convey what words never could. She stitched questions in the form of flowers that turned toward light, hopes in the shape of birds with wings spread for flight, gratitude in patterns that spiraled outward like ripples on still water. The most daring piece she created showed two hands reaching toward each other across a divide, one marked with the raised ridges of old burns, the other small and stained with the honest dirt of hard work. Between the hands, she embroidered a bridge made of silver thread and golden light, a connection that transcended the differences that society insisted mattered most. When she found that piece gone the next day, replaced by a note that simply said, "Yes," Lira felt something she had never experienced before, the certainty that she was truly known by another person, that her inner self had been seen and accepted rather than judged and found wanting. The correspondence began to include small lessons that expanded her world beyond the castle walls. He would leave pressed flowers from distant meadows, each one accompanied by notes that described the places where they grew. He shared poems copied, in his careful script, verses that spoke of exile and return, of finding beauty in unexpected places, of the courage required to hope when hope seemed foolish. In return, Lira began embroidering maps of imaginary kingdoms where she placed all the wonders he described. She created meadows that bloomed eternal spring, mountains crowned with cities that welcomed wanderers, rivers that carried away sorrows while preserving joys. Each piece was a gift of imagination, a way of saying that his memories had become her dreams. But even as this secret friendship bloomed like a garden hidden from harsh weather, the world beyond their quiet correspondence grew more troubled. Word came daily of Valyrian forces moving closer to Drakmor's borders, and the castle's atmosphere grew thick with tension and preparation. Nobles who had lived lives of comfortable routine found themselves discussing supply lines and defensive strategies. Servants who had never looked beyond their daily tasks began to wonder what would happen if war truly came to their mountain kingdom. In the kitchens, Cook Marta noticed changes in Lira that brought both worry and hope to her kind heart. The girl still bore the marks of regular beatings, still moved through her tasks with the careful efficiency of someone who had learned that survival meant invisibility. But there was something different in her eyes now, a light that spoke of secrets held close and treasured. "You've been staying up late, child," Marta observed one morning, noting the shadows under Lyra's eyes and the way her fingers moved as if still stitching even when they held nothing but a cleaning rag. "I hope you're not making yourself ill with worry about all this war talk." Lira shook her head, offering one of her rare smiles as she accepted the bowl of porridge Marta pressed into her hands. How could she explain that for the first time in her life, she felt less alone in the world? How could she convey that someone had seen her true self and found it worthy of attention, worthy of beauty, worthy of the kind of careful response that treated her thoughts as valuable? She couldn't speak these truths, but perhaps she could stitch them into her next piece of tapestry. That showed a servant girl discovering that kindness could exist in the most unexpected places. That understanding could bridge any gap if both hearts were willing to reach across the divide. The wooden hand mirror appeared in her sanctuary, like a question she had never thought to ask. Unlike the precious gifts of silver wire and fine threads, this was a simple thing, polished wood frame worn smooth by handling, silver glass that had lost some of its clarity around the edges. But when Lira picked it up and saw her own reflection clearly for the first time in her life, the mirror became the most transformative gift she had ever received. the face that looked back at her, was not the worthless creature described in Matron Grell's cruel words. Dark eyes that she had always thought of as unremarkable held depths that spoke of intelligence and feeling. Her hair, which she kept tied back in the plainest style possible, caught the filtered sunlight and revealed traces of auburn that made it gleam like polished wood. Her features, though marked by the thinness that came from never having quite enough to eat, were delicate rather than sharp, interesting rather than plain. For 17 years, she had seen herself only in fragments glimpses, caught in the surfaces of water or polished metal, distorted reflections that confirmed what others told her about her appearance. Now, holding the mirror with hands that trembled slightly, she saw herself as a whole person for the first time. Not beautiful in the way that Princess Serafina was beautiful, with golden hair and features arranged in perfect symmetry, but not the burden that Matron Grell insisted she was either. The note left with the mirror was longer than the others, written in the elegant script she had come to treasure. I have watched you move through these halls like someone who believes herself invisible, and I want you to see what I see, not a burden or a broken thing, but a person whose very existence proves that worth cannot be measured by the standards others impose. Look at yourself with the same eyes you use when creating your art, and see the beauty that has always been there. That evening, Lira found herself studying her reflection by candlelight, trying to understand the disconnect between how she appeared and how she had been taught to think of herself. She traced the shape of her face with one finger, noting the pale way her eyes reflected the candle flame, the way her lips curved naturally upward even when she wasn't consciously smiling. This was the face that had inspired kindness from Cook Marta, curiosity from a prince, art from her own hands. Perhaps it was not the face of someone worthless after all. The gifts that followed the mirror showed a mind that understood how to nurture growth in another person. Books began appearing, not the heavy theological texts that filled the castle's library, but collections of poetry and tales from distant lands. Each book came with notes written in the margins, thoughts and questions that treated her as an intellectual equal rather than a child to be instructed. What do you think of this poet's claim that silence can be more eloquent than speech? One note asked, written beside a verse about the power of unspoken understanding. Your embroidery suggests you know truths about communication that most people never discover. Lira had learned to read through necessity and observation, but these books opened worlds she had never imagined. She discovered that other kingdoms had different customs, that some cultures valued different qualities than power and volume of voice. She read about places where artists were revered, where beauty was considered essential rather than frivolous, where wisdom was measured by understanding rather than authority. In response, her embroidery grew more sophisticated, more confident. She began incorporating symbols and themes from the poetry he shared, creating visual interpretations of verses that spoke to her heart. When she read about the nightingale that sang most beautifully in darkness, she embroidered a bird whose song appeared as silver threads spiraling through night-dark fabric. When she encountered a poem about love that transcended physical form, she created two souls touching while their earthly bodies remained separate, connected by light that bridged any distance. The correspondence evolved beyond gifts and responses. He began leaving longer writings, not formal letters, but thoughts shared as if they were sitting together in comfortable companionship. He wrote about his years in exile, the way solitude had taught him to find company in books and nature, the gradual understanding that his scars were not marks of shame, but evidence of survival. I spent so many years believing that my damaged face made me unfit for human connection, one passage read. I convinced myself that exile was kindness to others, sparing them the discomfort of my presence. But you have shown me that true beauty lies in what we create and how we treat each other, not in the accidents of birth or the misfortunes of circumstance. Lira responded with her most personal work, yet a self-portrait worked in threads that seemed to glow with inner light. She showed herself not as she appeared in the harsh judgment of daylight, but as she felt when creating her art, radiant with purpose, beautiful in the way that came from doing work that mattered. Around the figure, she embroidered the tools of various crafts, needles and threads. Yes, but also quills and brushes, hammers and chisels. All the implements people used to create beauty in the world. When that piece disappeared and was replaced by a note that simply said, "You are magnificent," Lira felt a transformation begin in her heart. That went deeper than any mirror could reveal. But their growing connection did not exist in isolation from the world's darker currents. The castle buzzed with increasing urgency as reports arrived daily of Valyrian forces massing near the border. What had begun as diplomatic posturing was clearly escalating into something more serious, and even the servants could feel the tension crackling through the stone corridors like lightning before a storm. Prince Calder found himself drawn back into the military discussions he had avoided for 30 years. His brother, King Aldrich, sought his counsel with a desperation that spoke of how few trusted advisors remained in these troubled times. The long exile had not diminished Calder's strategic mind. If anything, years of surviving alone in hostile territory had sharpened his understanding of tactics and terrain. "The border fortresses are undermanned," Calder reported after returning from a reconnaissance journey that had taken him away from the castle for nearly a week. "Valeria has been testing our response times, probing for weaknesses. This isn't random aggression. Someone is planning a coordinated assault." The absence of their correspondence during that week had affected Lira more deeply than she had expected. She found herself checking their hidden meeting place multiple times each day, hoping for some sign that he had returned safely. When she finally discovered a new note waiting for her, she pressed it to her chest before reading it, grateful beyond words that their connection remained unbroken. "I am sorry for the silence," the note began. "Duty called me away from the conversations that have become the brightest part of my days. In the wild places beyond our borders, I found myself thinking not of strategic advantages or defensive positions, but of how to describe the way morning light turns frost into diamonds, because I knew you would transform such descriptions into art that captures beauty I could only glimpse." He had included pressed leaves from the border regions, their autumn colors preserved like memories made tangible. Lira incorporated them into a new piece that showed a castle surrounded not by threatening armies, but by forests that changed with the seasons, a reminder that even in times of conflict, the world continued its cycles of death and renewal, destruction and creation. The political situation grew more complex when Lord Vex began advocating for increasingly harsh measures. He suggested that wartime required sacrifices from everyone, including the servants who consumed resources without contributing to the kingdom's defense. His eyes lingered on Lira when he spoke of unnecessary burdens that could be eliminated to streamline the castle's operations. "A mute servant who breaks more than she fixes," he said during one particularly tense council meeting, his voice carrying clearly through the corridors where Lira was cleaning nearby chambers. "In times like these, can we afford to maintain charity cases that serve no practical purpose?" Princess Seraphina, who rarely involved herself in political discussions, surprised everyone by speaking up. "The measure of a kingdom's strength lies not only in its ability to defend itself, but in how it treats its most vulnerable members. If we abandon our principles in the name of efficiency, what exactly are we defending?" Her words created ripples of discussion that reached even the servants' quarters, where such philosophical questions were usually considered far above their station. Cook Marta found herself nodding in agreement as she kneaded bread with unusual vigor, her thoughts turning to the girl she had protected as best she could for so many years. But Matron Grell's response was predictably harsh. "Princes or not, she doesn't understand the practical realities of managing servants," she told the gathered kitchen staff. That mute girl has been acting strange lately, disappearing for hours when she should be working. Mark my words, she's up to something. That will bring trouble on all of us. The scrutiny made Lira more careful about her visits to the hidden room, but it couldn't dim the light that had begun growing inside her. For the first time in her life, she understood that her value as a person didn't depend on other people's approval or recognition. She had worth because she existed, because she created beauty, because she was capable of connection and understanding and love. This newfound confidence began to show in small ways that even she didn't fully recognize. She carried herself with slightly more assurance, met people's eyes more directly, and responded to cruelty with dignity rather than cowering. The changes were subtle, but in a place where everyone knew their exact position in the hierarchy. Even small shifts in behavior were noticeable. When Matron Grell raised her hand to deliver one of her routine beatings for an imagined infraction, Lira stepped back instead of accepting the blow passively. She didn't resist. That would have brought far worse consequences, but her movement suggested that she no longer believed she deserved such treatment simply for existing. The moment stretched taut between them, Matron Grell's hand frozen in the air, her eyes narrowing as she recognized something different in the girl who had always been her easiest target. "You're getting ideas above your station," she said finally, lowering her hand but not her voice. "Ideas can be dangerous things for people like you." That night, Lira worked by candlelight on a piece that showed a small tree growing in the crack of a stone wall. Despite the harsh conditions, despite the weight of rock pressing down upon it, the tree had found a way to reach toward the light. Its roots ran deep, drawing nourishment from hidden springs. Its branches stretched wide to catch every available ray of sun dot around the tree. She embroidered the faces of all those who had shown her kindness. Cook Marta with her flour-dusted apron, a prince whose scars had become beautiful in her eyes. Even Princess Serafina, whose unexpected defense had meant more than the girl could know. Each face was worked in threads that seemed to glow with their own light, a reminder that kindness existed even in the darkest places. That hope could take root in the most unlikely soil. When she left the piece in their meeting place, she included her own note for the first time, not written in words she couldn't trust to spell correctly, but embroidered directly onto the fabric in letters formed from a golden thread. "Thank you for helping me see that I am not broken, only different. Thank you for showing me that different can be beautiful." The response came not in the form of another note, but as the most precious gift, a small pendant carved from wood and hung on a leather cord. The carving showed a nightingale in full song, its beak open, its wings spread wide, every feather detailed with loving precision. It was the kind of work that took days to complete, the kind of gift that spoke of time spent thinking about the recipient, of hands that had worked to create something specifically for her. Wrapped around the cord was a strip of fabric bearing a single word, embroidered in silver thread, "Always." As Lira fastened the pendant around her neck, feeling its gentle weight settle against her heart, she understood that she was no longer the same person who had knelt among crystal shards just weeks before. She had been seen, known, valued, and, in being valued by another, she had learned to value herself. The changes in her were subtle but real, and in a castle where everyone's position was carefully observed and jealously guarded. Change rarely went unnoticed for long. The sapphire pendant arrived on a morning when frost painted the castle windows with delicate crystal patterns, each one unique as a fingerprint, beautiful as a prayer. Lira discovered it wrapped in silk so fine it felt like captured moonlight, nestled in their secret meeting place, like a star that had fallen to earth and chosen to stay. She had never seen a gemstone so blue it seemed to hold the depth of summer skies within its faceted surface. The sapphire was set in silver that had been worked into the shape of a flowering vine, each leaf and petal crafted with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of hours spent in contemplation of beauty. This was not merely jewelry. This was a family heirloom, the sort of precious thing that passed from generation to generation, carrying with it the weight of history and the promise of permanence. The significance was not lost on her. To give such a thing to a servant, to a mute girl who officially held no value in the social order of the castle, was more than generosity. It was recognition. It was a declaration that she mattered enough to be entrusted with something irreplaceable. Her hands trembled as she fastened the delicate chain around her neck, letting the pendant rest against her heart, where its gentle weight felt like a promise. Being kept. She understood now, with absolute certainty, that her mysterious correspondent was not merely a kind noble taking pity on a disadvantaged servant. The quality of his gifts, the sophistication of his thoughts, the very risk he took in maintaining their correspondence, all of it pointed to someone whose attention meant more than she had dared to imagine. That evening, working by the light of 3 precious candles she had saved for weeks, Lira began her most ambitious creation yet. On a piece of fine linen large enough to serve as a wall hanging, she began to embroider their story, not as it was, but as it lived in her heart. She showed 2 souls recognizing each other across the artificial barriers that society had built. Between them, reaching toward connection, despite the differences that others insisted should keep them apart, dot at the center of the tapestry. She placed 2 figures standing in a garden that bloomed eternal spring. One bore the subtle suggestion of scars worked in silver thread that caught light like wisdom earned through pain. The other was small and dark-haired, her hands glowing with golden thread as she wove beauty into the very air around them. Between them grew a tree whose roots intertwined beneath the earth, while its branches reached toward the same stars. A symbol of connection that ran deeper than surface differences. Around the central figures, she embroidered the gifts that had passed between them, books that opened into flights of birds carrying knowledge across vast distances, mirrors that reflected not physical appearance but the truth of souls, threads that connected hearts regardless of the space between bodies. Each element told part of their story, but together they created something larger. A testament to the transformative power of being truly seen by another person. The work consumed her for days. She stole moments between tasks, working until her eyes burned and her fingers ached, driven by a need to capture, in thread, what words could never express. When sleep finally claimed her, she dreamed in colors and patterns, her unconscious mind continuing the work her hands had begun. When the tapestry was complete, she wrapped it carefully in clean linen and placed it in their meeting place, along with a note embroidered in golden letters. This is how I see us, not prince and servant, but 2 people who found each other in a world that tried to keep us apart. Thank you for showing me that love can exist in the space between heartbeats, in the silence between words, in the understanding that needs no voice to speak its truth. The response came more quickly than usual, as if he had been waiting as eagerly as she for this exchange. She found the tapestry returned, but not unchanged. Woven throughout her work with threads so fine they seemed made of light itself, he had added his own contribution. Silver and gold threads now connected every element of the design, creating a network of light that made the entire piece seem to glow from within. But more precious than the added beauty was the letter that accompanied it, not a brief note, but pages of careful script that revealed depths she had only guessed at before. "My dearest friend," it began, and those 3 words made her heart race with joy she had never imagined possible. "What you have created is more than art. It is prophecy, hope made visible, love given form. You see us as we could be, as we are in the space beyond titles and expectations. And seeing us that way, you make it true. I must tell you who I am, though I fear the knowledge will change everything between us. I am Calder, 2nd son of the late king, brother to Aldrich, who rules now. I am the prince who bears scars not just on his face, but in his heart, who fled this place 30 years ago, because he believed himself too damaged for human connection. I am the exile who thought he had learned to live without hope, until your embroidery showed me that beauty can bloom in the darkest places. I know what you must be thinking, that I am merely a bored noble amusing himself with a servant's curiosity, that this correspondence is nothing more than a passing fancy for someone who has everything while you have nothing. But you would be wrong. In your silence, I have found the most eloquent conversation of my life. In your art, I had discovered truths about beauty that all my education failed to teach. In your courage to continue creating despite the cruelty that surrounds you, I have found inspiration to stop hiding from my own life. You asked me once, in thread and image, why I care about a voiceless servant girl. The answer is simple, because you are not voiceless at all. Your needle speaks truths that most people's words never approach. Your art reveals a soul so beautiful that it makes my physical scars seem like insignificant scratches on the surface of what really matters. I am falling in love with you, not with the idea of you, not with the romance of correspondence with a mysterious figure, but with the real person who transforms pain into beauty, who finds hope in hopeless places, who has taught me that worth cannot be measured by the standards others impose. I love your intelligence, your creativity, your resilience, your capacity for finding light in darkness. I love the way you see the world and the way you help me see it differently. If this knowledge frightens you, if the reality of who I am makes our connection impossible, I will understand. I ask nothing of you except that you continue to exist in this world, to continue creating your art, to continue being the extraordinary person you are. But if you can find it in your heart to care for a scarred prince who has spent too many years believing himself unlovable, then perhaps we can build something together that transcends the boundaries others would place around us. Lira read the letter 3 times before its full meaning settled into her heart. A prince, not just any noble, but Prince Calder himself, had been her correspondent, her friend, her confessor, her inspiration. The scarred exile who walked the castle halls with quiet dignity was the same person who had seen her beaten in that storage room and recognized the art she created as worthy of response. The revelation recontextualized everything, every gift, every note, every moment of connection they had shared. This was not charity or condescension, but genuine feeling from someone whose attention was valuable beyond measure. He was offering not just affection, but love, the kind that saw past surface differences to recognize the truth of souls. Her response came in the form of an embroidered portrait that took her 2 sleepless nights to complete. She showed him as she truly saw him, not the damaged prince that others whispered about, but a man whose scars spoke of survival rather than shame, whose eyes held depths that came from understanding pain and choosing kindness anyway. She embroidered him surrounded by light that seemed to emanate from within, beautiful not despite his imperfections, but because of the way he had transformed them into wisdom dotted around the portrait. She worked words in golden thread. Your scars do not make you less beautiful, they make you real. Your exile did not make you unworthy of love. It made you someone who understands the value of connection. You are not broken. You are not damaged. You are a man who has learned to see beauty in unexpected places, and that makes you beautiful beyond measure. When she placed the portrait in their meeting place, her heart hammered with the knowledge that everything was about to change. They could no longer hide behind the safety of anonymity, could no longer pretend that their connection existed in some neutral space beyond the reach of the castle's rigid social structure. He was a prince, and she was a servant, and the world had very strong opinions about such differences. But as she walked back through the castle corridors, the sapphire pendant warm against her heart, Lira discovered that she was not afraid. For the first time in her life, she had been loved for exactly who she was, and that knowledge was armor stronger than any fear society could wield against her matron. Grell found the torn fragment of letter on a Tuesday morning when the autumn wind howled through the castle corridors like a living thing seeking entry. The piece of parchment had caught on a rough stone in the passage leading to the storage rooms, a single corner bearing elegant script that made the older woman's eyes narrow with predatory interest. She recognized quality when she saw it. The expensive paper, the educated handwriting, the few visible words that spoke of affection and understanding. This was correspondence far above a servant's station, and in a castle where information was currency and secrets were weapons, Matron Grell knew she had stumbled upon something valuable. "Go!" Her voice cracked through the kitchens like a whip, sending other servants scurrying to appear busy. "Come here." Now, Lira appeared from the pantry where she had been checking stores, her dark hair slightly disheveled from reaching high shelves, her hands still dusty from handling grain sacks. She saw the paper in Matron Grell's grasp and felt her heart stop for the space of 3 beats before resuming at double speed. "Explain this." Matron Grell held up the fragment, her gray eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction. "Explain why." "Expensive paper with noble handwriting was found near the storage rooms where you've been disappearing to." Lyra's hand moved instinctively to sign her confusion, but Matron Grell grabbed her wrists with painful force. "None of your hand-waving nonsense. I know you understand every word I say, even if you can't answer. This letter, who gave it to you? What noble have you been meeting in secret?" The older woman's grip tightened, her fingers pressing into the bones of Lyra's wrists until tears sprang to the girl's eyes. But Lira shook her head, unwilling to betray the correspondence that had brought light into her dark world, unable to speak even if she had wanted to protect herself with words. Stubborn little beast. Matron Grell released her wrists only to grab a handful of Lyra's hair, yanking her head back to force eye contact. "You think silence makes you special? You think keeping secrets makes you clever? I've broken stronger servants than you, girl. I'll have the truth from you before this day is done." The interrogation lasted for hours. Matron Grell employed every cruelty she had learned in decades of managing servants through fear threats of starvation, promises of beatings, descriptions of the dungeon cells where disobedient staff learned the price of defiance. She demanded names, details, explanations for behavior that had been noted and cataloged over weeks of observation. But Lira remained silent, not from choice, but from nature, and even if she had possessed a voice, she would not have used it to destroy the most precious thing in her life. Each blow, each threat, each moment of pain only strengthened her resolve to protect the correspondence that had taught her she was worthy of love. When Matron Grell finally exhausted herself with cruelty, Lira was left curled on the floor of the storage room that served as an interrogation chamber, her body a map of fresh bruises painted over old ones. The older woman stood over her, breathing heavily from exertion and frustration. "This isn't over," she panted, her face flushed with effort and anger. "I know you're hiding something, and I will discover what it is. When I do, you'll wish you had told me willingly. Secret correspondences, forbidden meetings, such things are treason when they involve the nobility. Do you understand what happens to servants who commit treason?" Lira understood perfectly. She also understood that some things were worth any risk, that the love she had discovered was more valuable than safety, more necessary than survival. As she lay on the cold stone floor, the sapphire pendant hidden beneath her rough dress pressed against her heart like a promise being kept. Meanwhile, Prince Calder paced his chambers with the restless energy of a caged wolf, his scarred face drawn tight with worry. Lira had missed their evening meeting for the first time since their correspondence began, and her absence filled him with dread that something terrible had happened to the woman who had become the center of his existence. He had spent the day in council meetings that felt increasingly urgent and increasingly futile. Reports from the border painted a picture of Valerian forces growing bolder, testing Drakmore's defenses with raids that stopped just short of acts of war. King Aldrich pressed for military solutions while Lord Vex advocated for diplomatic approaches that sounded suspiciously like surrender. "We cannot afford to appear weak," Calder had argued, his strategic mind focused despite his personal worries. "Valeria respects strength, not appeasement. If we yield ground now, they will see it as invitation to take more." But even as he spoke of tactics and troop movements, part of his mind remained fixed on the missing meeting, the empty space where Lira's latest creation should have been waiting. In the few weeks since their correspondence began, her art had become as necessary to him as air, her silent voice the one he trusted most in a world full of spoken lies. When the council session finally ended, he made his way through the castle's forgotten passages to their meeting place, hoping against reason that she might appear with some explanation for her absence. Instead, he found signs of disturbance dust that had been kicked up by struggling feet, a few drops of blood on the stone floor that made his heart contract with protective fury. Someone had discovered their secret. Someone had hurt Lira because of her connection to him. The knowledge filled him with a rage so pure it frightened him with its intensity. For 30 years, he had lived peacefully, avoiding conflict, accepting exile rather than fighting for his place. But the thought of anyone harming the woman he loved awakened something primal and dangerous in his scarred heart. The political situation provided convenient cover for his investigation. As tensions with Valeria escalated, security within the castle had tightened, making it natural for a prince to ask questions about servant behavior, to inquire about potential security breaches, to investigate any irregularities that might indicate foreign influence. It didn't take long to discover that Matron Grell had been asking questions about secret meetings and forbidden correspondence. Other servants, eager to curry favor or avoid suspicion themselves, reported that the head of staff had been particularly interested in the mute girl's recent behavior. Cook Marta, when carefully questioned, revealed her own growing concern for Lira's welfare. "That child has been disappearing more often lately," she admitted, her kind face creased with worry. "And Matron Grell has been watching her like a hawk watches a mouse. I fear something bad is going to happen to that poor girl." The confirmation of his fears sent Calder to Lord Vex's chambers, where he found the king's advisor bent over maps and supply reports. The older man looked up with surprise when the prince entered without announcement, his pale eyes taking in Calder's grim expression with calculating interest. "Your Highness, I wasn't expecting you. Is there news from the border?" "I need to discuss security within the castle," Calder said, his voice carefully controlled despite the fury burning in his chest. "There are reports of servants engaging in suspicious activities, secret meetings, unauthorized correspondence. Such things could indicate Valerian infiltration." Lord Vex's eyes sharpened with interest, and Calder saw immediately that the man knew more than he was revealing. Indeed, internal security is crucial during times like these. Perhaps it would be wise to investigate these reports thoroughly, root out any potential threats before they can do damage. The conversation continued for several more minutes, each man probing carefully for information while revealing as little as possible. But Calder left with the certain knowledge that Lord Vex saw opportunity in the situation, that Lyra's secret correspondence had become a political weapon in hands that would use it without mercy. That night, he sat in his chambers staring at the portrait she had embroidered of him, her vision of his scarred face transformed by love into something beautiful. The thought of her suffering because of their connection, of her silence being used against her because she couldn't defend herself with words, filled him with a determination that burned away 30 years of careful caution. He was done hiding, done accepting that his scars made him unfit for human connection, done allowing others to decide what he deserved based on their prejudices and fears. Lira had shown him that love could exist in the space between heartbeats, and he would fight. For that love, regardless of the cost. The time for secret correspondence was ending. Soon, he would have to choose between protecting himself and protecting the woman who had taught him that he was worthy of love. For Calder, scarred prince and former exile, it was no choice at all. The dungeon cleaning was meant as punishment, but it became revelation. Matron Grell had assigned Lira to scrub the deepest cells as both cruelty and opportunity. Cruelty, because the work was backbreaking and demoralizing. Opportunity, because isolation might finally break the girl's stubborn silence about her mysterious correspondence. Lira descended the narrow stone steps with her bucket of soapy water and coarse brushes, each step taking her deeper into the castle's forgotten foundations. These cells hadn't housed prisoners in decades, but they retained the smell of old fear and older despair. Water seeped through cracks in the ancient stone, creating pools that reflected the flickering light of her single candle like dark mirrors. The work was indeed brutal. Years of neglect had allowed grime and mold to coat every surface, and the rough stone scraped her already injured hands raw. But there was something almost meditative about the repetitive motion of scrubbing, the gradual revelation of clean stone beneath layers of accumulated dirt. In the silence of the deep dungeons, she could think without interruption, could process the fear and confusion of the past few days. She had been working for hours when her brush caught on what felt like a loose stone in the wall of the deepest cell. Curious, she pressed against it, feeling it shift slightly under pressure. Years of accumulated grime had hidden what appeared to be a deliberate gap in the stonework. Not damage, but designed out with careful fingers. She worked the stone free, revealing a hidden compartment carved into the wall behind it. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather that had protected them from decades of dampness, lay documents that made her heart race even before she understood their full significance. The papers were official. She could tell that much from the heavy seals and formal script, even though the words were difficult for her to decipher in the uncertain candlelight. But one document caught her attention immediately. A birth certificate bearing a name that made her hands tremble as she traced the elegant lettering. Princess Liana of Valeria. Born in the same year as Lira herself, to parents whose names she recognized from overheard political discussions. The certificate described a baby girl with dark hair and dark eyes, born during a winter storm that had isolated the Valerian royal castle from the outside world. Below the birth certificate lay other documents, correspondence between Valerian nobles, reports of political instability, and finally, a letter that made Lira's world shift on its axis, like a mountain deciding to relocate itself. The princes must be hidden until the threat passes. The letter read in script she had to puzzle out word by word. The assassination of the king and queen makes her the rightful heir, but also the primary target. She will be safer among common people, her identity concealed, until we can restore stability to the kingdom. The trauma of witnessing her parents' murder has rendered her unable to speak, perhaps a blessing, as silence will help protect her true nature. The letter was signed by someone identified as Royal Guardian M, and dated 17 years ago, the winter when Lira had arrived at Drakmore Castle as a traumatized child, brought by a woman who claimed to be her dying mother. Lira sat back on her heels, the documents scattered around her on the cell floor, her mind reeling with implications that restructured everything she thought she knew about herself. The mute servant girl who scrubbed floors and endured beatings was actually a princess, not just any princess, but the lost heir to the kingdom that now threatened Drakmore's borders. More pieces of the puzzle lay in the compartment. A small silver medallion bearing the royal seal of Valeria, a lock of baby hair, dark as her own, tied with ribbon that had once been gold, but had faded to pale yellow. A miniature portrait of a woman whose face was unmistakably similar to Lira's own, painted with the kind of loving detail that spoke of maternal devotion. The woman in the portrait wore a crown and the confident expression of someone born to rule. But her eyes held the same depth Lyra had seen in her own reflection when Prince Calder's mirror showed her that she was more than others claimed. This was her mother, not the fever-stricken peasant woman who had brought her to the castle, but Queen Elena of Valeria, murdered by political enemies who wanted to seize her throne. As understanding flooded through her, other memories began to surface, fragments that had been buried beneath years of trauma and the daily struggle for survival. Flashes of a grand castle with windows that caught sunlight and threw rainbows across marble floors. The sound of her mother's voice singing lullabies in a language that was almost familiar. The terrible night when men with swords had broken down doors, when screams had echoed through corridors, when a small girl had hidden in a wardrobe and watched her parents die. The shock of recovered memory was so overwhelming that she barely heard the footsteps on the dungeon stairs. When Prince Calder appeared in the doorway of the cell, his scarred face tight with worry and determination, she was still sitting among the scattered documents, tears streaming down her face as 17 years of buried truth crashed through. Her consciousness like a dam finally giving way. "Lira?" His voice was gentle, but she could hear the underlying tension. "I've been searching everywhere for you. When I heard Matron Grell had assigned you to dungeon duty, He stopped speaking when he saw the documents spread around her, his eyes taking in the official seals, the portrait, the silver medallion she clutched in one trembling hand. His expression shifted from concern to amazement as he began to understand what she had discovered. "Dear God," he whispered, kneeling beside her among the papers. "These are Valyrian royal documents. This is," he picked up the birth certificate, his eyes scanning the formal language with the speed of someone educated in court protocols. "Princess Lyanna, the lost princess that Valeria has been searching for." But that would mean... He looked at her with dawning comprehension, seeing not the servant girl he had fallen in love with, but the missing heir to a kingdom, the rightful ruler of the very forces that threatened his homeland. The woman whose silence he had learned to treasure was silent because witnessing her parents' assassination had stolen her voice along with her identity. "You're not just Lira," he said softly, his scarred hand reaching out to touch her face with infinite gentleness. "You're Princess Lyanna of Valeria. The woman I love is royalty." The revelation recontextualized everything about their relationship. She was not a servant reaching above her station. She was a princess who outranked him in every formal measure of nobility. Their love was not forbidden because of her low birth, but complicated because she represented the very kingdom that threatened his homeland. But more than that, her true identity explained the forces gathering beyond Drakmor's borders. The Valerian troops massing for invasion were not seeking conquest, they were searching for their lost princess. The diplomatic demands that sounded like threats were desperate attempts to recover the rightful heir to their throne. "This changes everything," Calder said, his mind racing through political implications even as his heart processed the emotional impact. "If Valeria knows you're here, if they're coming to reclaim their princess, they don't know." The words came out as barely a whisper, Lyra's voice returning for the first time since childhood, as the trauma that had stolen it was finally understood and acknowledged. Her vocal cords were rusty from disuse, her speech halting and uncertain. But the sound of her own voice, speaking his name, made both of them catch their breath. "Calder, they think I'm dead. The woman who brought me here, she must have been the royal guardian mentioned in the letters. She saved me by making me disappear." Her voice grew stronger with each word, as if remembering how to speak was like remembering how to breathe, difficult at first, then increasingly natural. "I remember now, some of it. My mother, my real mother, she told me to hide. She said there were bad men coming, and I had to be very quiet, very still. I watched them." Her voice broke. "I watched them kill my parents." Calder gathered her into his arms, mindful of her recent injuries, but unable to resist offering comfort. She felt different against him now, not fragile, but strong in a way that had always been there, but was now acknowledged. This was a woman who had survived assassination, exile, and years of abuse while maintaining her sanity and her capacity for love. This was a princess who had learned to find strength in silence, beauty in suffering, hope in the darkest places. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice still soft but gaining confidence with each word. "I am Princess Liana of Valeria, but I am also Lira, who loves Prince Calder of Drakmor. I am the heir to the kingdom that threatens your homeland, but I am also the woman who wants nothing more than to stay in your arms forever." Before he could answer, they heard voices echoing down the dungeon stairs. Lord Vex's distinctive tone mixed with Matron Grell's harsh authority. The conversation they had been having about security and suspicious servants was about to become very real and very dangerous. "Hide the documents," Calder whispered urgently. "Say nothing about what we've discovered. If Lord Vex learns your true identity, he already suspects something," Lira said, her newfound voice carrying certainty that came from years of observing while being overlooked. "He knows about our correspondence. This discovery will give him the weapon he needs to destroy us both." As the footsteps grew closer, Calder helped her conceal the documents in her clothing, his hands gentle but swift. Whatever came next, they would face it together, a scarred prince and a rediscovered princess, their love now complicated by politics that could start or end a war. The war council that convened the morning after Lyra's discovery looked different through the eyes of someone who finally understood her place in the larger political landscape. She stood at the edge of the great hall, officially present to serve refreshments, but actually listening to every word with the keen attention of someone whose entire world had shifted overnight. Maps covered the massive oak table like prophecies written in ink and parchment. Red markers showed Valyrian positions along the border, their forces arranged not in the scattered pattern of raiders, but in the organized formations of an army preparing for siege. Blue markers indicated Drakmor's defensive positions, pathetically few compared to the threat they faced. 30,000 troops, Lord Vex reported, his pale eyes reflecting the morning light that streamed through the hall's tall windows. "Perhaps more. Their supply lines are well established, and their advance scouts have been mapping our defenses for weeks. This is not a raid or a territorial dispute. This is preparation for full conquest." King Aldrich studied the maps with the weary expression of a man who had inherited problems he never sought. "What do they want?" "Valeria has never shown interest in our mountain passes before. Our trade routes, yes, but not our actual territory. Intelligence suggests they're searching for something," Lord Vex continued, his voice carefully neutral. "Or someone. There are reports of Valyrian nobles asking questions in border villages, offering rewards for information about a young woman with certain characteristics." Lyra's hand moved instinctively to the hidden documents concealed beneath. Her servant's dress, the papers that proved she was the object of this search. Around the table, the kingdom's leaders debated her fate without knowing she stood among them, invisible in the way that servants always were until someone needed to assign blame. Prince Calder sat at his brother's right hand, his scarred face, a mask of careful attention that revealed nothing of the storm raging beneath. He had spent the night planning, his strategic mind, working through scenarios and contingencies, while his heart struggled with the implications of loving a woman whose very existence could prevent or cause a war. "We need to understand their true objectives," Calder said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived alone in hostile territory. "If they're searching for someone specific, perhaps we can use that knowledge to our advantage. What do we know about this missing person they seek?" Lord Vex consulted his papers with theatrical precision. A young woman, dark hair, dark eyes, approximately 17 years of age, possibly mute or otherwise unable to speak clearly. There are suggestions she might be of noble birth, though the details remain unclear. The description hung in the air like smoke from a fire that everyone could smell, but no one could locate. Lira felt the weight of every gaze that didn't quite settle on her, the dangerous proximity of discovery that made her heart race even as she maintained the posture of humble service. "If we found this person," King Aldrich said slowly, "would Valeria withdraw their forces?" "Unknown, Your Majesty. But it seems likely that recovering this individual is central to their current campaign. Whether they would be satisfied with peaceful return or demand territorial concessions as well remains to be seen." Princess Serafina, who rarely spoke during political discussions, looked up from her embroidery with an expression of thoughtful concern. "If this person they seek is indeed in our territory, don't we have a moral obligation to consider their wishes in the matter? Perhaps they don't want to be found. Perhaps they found safety here that they wouldn't have elsewhere." Her words carried more weight than she realized, and Lira felt a surge of gratitude toward the princess whose unexpected defense had protected her once before. But Lord Vex's response chilled her blood. "In times of war, individual preferences must yield to the greater good," he said with the cold certainty of someone who had never had his own preferences ignored. "If returning one person could save thousands of lives, the choice becomes clear regardless of personal desires." That afternoon, while the castle buzzed with military preparations and diplomatic considerations, Lira found herself in the familiar sanctuary of the kitchens, where Cook Marta kneaded bread with the kind of fierce concentration that suggested she was working through her own fears. "Bad times coming," Marta muttered, her flour-dusted hands punching down the dough with unnecessary force. "War always brings suffering to those who can least afford it. The nobles will retreat to their strongholds, while common folk pay the price in blood and hunger." "Marta," Lira said, her voice still soft and uncertain, but growing stronger with each word she spoke. "I need to tell you something." The older woman looked up in surprise, her kind eyes widening as she registered that the girl she had protected for so many years was finally speaking. "Child, your voice? How long have you been able to speak?" "Only since yesterday. I remembered things about who I was before I came here." Lira moved closer, lowering her voice to barely above a whisper. "I know who I really am, and I know why Valeria is gathering forces at our borders." What followed was the most difficult conversation of Lira's life. She watched Cook Marta's expression shift from surprise to amazement to fear as the truth unfolded. That the mute servant girl she had protected was actually the missing princess of Valoria, that the approaching army was searching for her, that revealing her identity could save the kingdom, but might cost her everything she had built here. My God. Marta breathed when the story was complete. "All these years, I've been harboring a princess without knowing it. No wonder you always seemed different from the other servants. No wonder your hands knew how to create such beautiful things, even when your voice couldn't speak. What should I do?" Lira asked, the question that had tormented her through a sleepless night. "If I reveal myself, I could stop the war. But I would have to leave everyone I've come to love. And there's no guarantee that Valeria would honor any agreement. They might take me and attack anyway." Marta's hand stilled on the bread dough as she considered the impossible weight of such a choice. "That's not a decision for an old cook to make, child. That's a choice that only a princess can make. And you are a princess, whether you wear a crown or a servant's dress." As if summoned by the conversation, Prince Calder appeared in the kitchen doorway, his presence filling the space. With barely contained energy, he had clearly been searching for Lira, and the relief on his scarred face when he saw her was immediately replaced by urgency. "We need to talk," he said, his eyes flicking to Cook Marta with polite acknowledgement but obvious impatience. "Both of you. What I have to say concerns the safety of everyone in this castle." Cook Marta, her protective instincts fully awakened by Lyra's revelation, stepped slightly in front of the girl despite the vast difference in their social stations. "Your Highness, if this is about the child's recent troubles with Matron Grell, it's about much more than that," Calder interrupted gently. "Marta, you've been protecting Lira far longer than you realized. But the protection she needs now is beyond what any of us can provide through secrecy alone." He moved into the kitchen and closed the door behind him, his actions creating the kind of private space that made even the most innocent conversation feel like conspiracy. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of decisions that could reshape kingdoms. "Lord Vex knows," he said simply. "Not everything, but enough. He's been investigating Lyra's background since Matron Grell reported her suspicious behavior. The torn letter, the questions about secret meetings, it's all led him to believe she's involved with foreign agents. He's planning to have her arrested for treason." Lira felt the blood drain from her face. "When?" "Tonight, after the evening meal, when the castle settles into its nightly routines. He intends to interrogate her himself, and Lord Vex's interrogations are not known for their gentleness." Calder's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "But there's more. I believe he suspects your true identity. The physical description Valeria has been circulating. The timing of your arrival at the castle, the way you've always been different. From other servants, he's connecting pieces." Cook Marta sank onto a nearby stool, her face pale with understanding. "If he discovers she's the Valerian princess, he'll use her as a bargaining chip," Calder finished grimly. "Either to negotiate with Valeria from a position of strength, or to curry favor with them by returning their lost heir. Either way, Lira becomes a political tool rather than a person." The kitchen fell silent except for the gentle bubbling of soup on the fire and the distant sounds of castle life continuing its routines. Three people who had found family in unexpected places now faced the dissolution of everything they had built together. "There's something else," Calder continued, his voice heavy with the weight of additional revelation. "Princess Serafina knows. Lyra's." Eyes widened in surprise and fear. "How?" "She's more observant than she lets on. She noticed the changes in your behavior, the way I've been protective of you, the unusual nature of the gifts you've been receiving. She put together enough pieces to ask direct questions." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "She's offering to help." "Help, Al?" Cook Marta asked, her practical mind immediately focusing on logistics rather than emotions. "She has contacts among the servants, people who owe her favors, routes through the castle that even I don't know about. If we need to move quickly, to get Lyra to safety before Lord Vex can act, she can provide assistance." But Lira was shaking her head, her newfound voice carrying a strength that surprised all of them. "No, I won't run anymore. I won't hide while good people suffer because of choices I'm too afraid to make." "Lira," Calder began, but she held up a hand to stop him. "My name is Liana," she said firmly. "Princess Liana of Valeria. And I have responsibilities that go beyond my personal safety or happiness." She stood straighter, and for the first time since discovering her true identity, she allowed herself to embody the royal bearing that had been bred into her bones. The change was subtle but unmistakable. The way she held her head, the straightness of her spine, the certainty in her voice when she spoke. "I've been thinking about this all night," she continued. "About who I am, what I owe to the people of both kingdoms, what my parents would have wanted me to do. I can't prevent this war by hiding from it. I can only end it by facing the truth of who I am." Cook Marta reached for her hand, her eyes bright with tears of pride and fear. "Child, your highness, are you certain? Once you reveal yourself, there's no going back to the life you've known here. The life I've known here has been built on." "A lie," Liana replied, though her voice was gentle with affection for the woman who had shown her maternal love. "A necessary lie that kept me alive, but still a lie. I am Princess Liana of Valeria, and my people are preparing to kill Calders. People to find me How can I let that happen when I have the power to stop it? Calder moved closer, his scarred hands reaching for hers with the kind of desperate tenderness that comes from knowing time is running out. If you reveal yourself, you'll have to return to Valeria. You'll have to claim a throne in a kingdom that's been ruled by others for 17 years. You'll be surrounded by people who remember your parents but don't know you, who will expect you to be someone you've never had the chance to become. I know, she whispered, her royal resolve wavering slightly in the face of losing the love that had transformed her understanding of herself. But I also know that love isn't about keeping what makes us happy, regardless of the cost to others. Love is about making choices that honor what we value most, even when those choices break our hearts. The afternoon dissolved into planning with the kind of desperate efficiency that comes from knowing disaster approaches on a fixed schedule. They had hours before Lord Vex would move against Lira, hours to prepare for a revelation that would change everything for everyone involved. Princess Serafina proved invaluable. Her network of loyal servants and her knowledge of court protocol, creating opportunities that wouldn't have existed otherwise. She provided access to chambers where Lyanna could bathe and dress appropriately for her revelation, garments that would transform a servant girl into recognizable royalty. The key, Serafina explained as she helped arrange Lyanna's dark hair, in a style befitting a princess, is controlling how the information becomes known. If Lord Vex discovers your identity through his investigation, he controls the narrative. But if you reveal yourself publicly, in the Great Hall before witnesses, you maintain agency over your own story. Cook Marta, meanwhile, prepared what might be their last meal together, her love expressed through the familiar ritual of nourishing those she cared about. Eat, she insisted, pressing bowls of hearty stew into their hands. Whatever comes next, you'll need strength for it. As evening approached and the moment of revelation drew near, Calder found himself alone with Lyanna in the small chamber, where she was preparing to transform herself from servant to princess. She wore a gown of deep blue silk that brought out the royal bearing in her posture, and her hair was arranged with the kind of elegant simplicity that spoke of noble breeding. "You're beautiful," he said softly, his scarred hands trembling slightly as he reached up to touch her face. "You've always been beautiful, but now you look like the princess you were born to be." "And you," she replied, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes, "look like the man I will love for the rest of my life, whether we're together or separated by the width of kingdoms." They held each other in the growing dusk, two people who had found love in the most unlikely circumstances, now facing its possible loss for the most noble reasons. Outside the castle prepared for evening routines, unaware that before the night was over, everything would change. The battle plans spread across tables in the war room would become irrelevant. The political calculations that had driven weeks of negotiation would be transformed by a single revelation. And a love that had grown in secret between a mute servant and a scarred prince would be tested by the weight of crowns and the expectations of kingdoms. As the bells rang for evening meal, Princess Lyanna of Valeria prepared to reclaim her identity, and in doing so, to discover whether love could survive the return of a lost princess to a world that had continued turning in her absence. The Great Hall had never felt more like a stage than it did that evening when Princess Lyanna walked through its massive doors dressed in royal blue silk instead of servants' rough cloth. The transformation was so complete that several nobles looked right through her, their eyes sliding past as if she were invisible in the way they had trained themselves not to see servants. The cook Marta had taught her well about timing, and Princess Serafina had coached her on court protocol. Lyanna waited until the evening meal was in full swing, until the hall buzzed with conversation and the warm hum of a community gathered around shared tables. Only then did she step forward into the space where servants never ventured uninvited. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall despite its softness. lords and ladies of Drakmore, I come before you tonight to prevent a war." The conversations died like candle flames snuffed by sudden wind. Every head turned toward the young woman who stood in the center of the hall with the kind of natural dignity that couldn't be taught or faked. King Aldrich looked up from his plate, his expression shifting from irritation at the interruption to surprise at the speaker's obvious noble bearing. "Who are you?" he asked, though something in his eye suggested he was beginning to suspect an answer that would change everything. "I am Princess Liana of Valeria," she replied, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Daughter of King Marcus and Queen Elena, murdered 17 years ago by those who sought to steal my kingdom's throne. I am the lost princess that Valerian forces seek at your borders. I am the reason 30,000 troops prepare to lay siege to your mountain home." The silence that followed was so complete it seemed to have weight of its own. Lord Vex half rose from his seat, his pale face flushed with something between triumph and calculation. Matron Grell, serving wine at the high table, dropped her pitcher with a crash that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. "Impossible," Lord Vex said finally. "This is clearly some servant girl's delusion of grandeur. The lost princess of Valeria has been dead for years." But Prince Calder was already standing, his scarred face set with grim determination. "She speaks the truth. I have seen the documents that prove her identity, birth certificates, correspondence, royal seals that cannot be forged. The woman we have known as Lira is indeed Princess Liana, hidden among us for her own protection." King Aldrich studied Liana with the careful attention of someone whose decisions shape kingdoms. "If this is true, if you are indeed Valerian royalty, then your presence here explains much about recent events. The question becomes, what do you propose we do with this knowledge?" Before Liana could answer, Lord Vex stepped forward with the kind of predatory smile that made smart prey seek deeper cover. "The solution is obvious, Your Majesty. We return the princess to her people in exchange for their withdrawal from our borders. A simple trade that prevents unnecessary bloodshed." "No." Liana's voice cut through his words like a blade through silk. "I will not be traded like a possession or a bargaining chip. I am Princess Liana of Valeria, and I speak for my kingdom when I say that this conflict serves no one's interests." She moved to the center of the hall, her presence commanding attention in a way that transcended her small stature. "The forces gathered at your borders march not as conquerors, but as a people searching for their lost heir. They seek me not to wage war, but to restore the legitimate rule to a kingdom that has suffered 17 years of chaos and usurpation." From her sleeve, she withdrew the war banner she had been embroidering in secret, a masterpiece that combined the symbols of both kingdoms in a pattern that suggested alliance rather than conflict. She held it high, letting the intricate needlework catch the light from hundreds of candles. "I propose not trade, but alliance," she continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone born to rule. "Let Drakmore and Valeria forge a bond based on mutual respect and shared prosperity rather than fear and suspicion. Let this war end not in conquest, but in wedding." The last word hung in the air like a bell that had been struck and continued to resonate. Every eye in the hall turned toward Prince Calder, whose scarred face showed no surprise at her proposal clearly. This was something they had discussed during their hurried planning. But before anyone could respond to her offer, Lord Vex's voice cracked across the hall like a whip. "Treason! She admits to secret correspondence with enemy forces. She confesses to hiding her identity while gathering intelligence about our defenses." His accusation sparked immediate chaos. Nobles began talking over each other, some demanding explanations, others calling for her immediate arrest. But it was Matron Grell who moved first, reaching for a carving knife from the serving table with the kind of desperate fury that comes from seeing a lifetime of carefully maintained power structures crumble in a single evening. "Lying witch!" she screamed, lunging toward Liana with the blade raised. 17 years I've put up with your silent insolence, your airs and graces. You're nothing but a servant who's learned to put on royal pretenses. Prince Calder moved with the reflexes of someone trained in combat, intercepting Matron Grell's attack and disarming her with efficiency that spoke of years fighting for survival in hostile territory. The knife clattered across the stone floor as he restrained the older woman, but her attack had served Lord Vex's purposes perfectly. You see? He called to the assembled nobles, his voice carrying over the commotion. She brings violence and chaos wherever she goes. How many more will die because we harbor this pretender to foreign thrones? But Princess Serafina rose from her seat at the high table, a voice cutting through the noise with royal authority that commanded immediate attention. Enough, she declared. Lord Vex, your accusations ignore the obvious truth that a servant girl could never have acquired the education, daring, and knowledge of court protocol that this young woman clearly possesses. And Matron Grell's attack proves only that cruelty seeks to destroy what it cannot control. The hall fell silent again, but it was a different kind of silence, tense, electric, with the potential for violence. Outside, the sound of horns began to echo across the mountain valleys, deep and mournful notes that could only mean one thing. The Valyrian forces are moving, King Aldrich said grimly, his head cocked toward the distant sound. Whether princess or pretender, her revelation has triggered the very conflict we sought to avoid. Liana stood in the center of the great hall, surrounded by chaos but radiating calm determination. The war banner remained in her hands, its embroidered symbols catching the light like a promise waiting to be kept. Around her, the fate of 2 kingdoms hung in the balance, waiting for decisions that would shape the future of everyone she had come to love. The morning sun painted the castle battlements gold as Princess Liana stood beside Prince Calder, watching. The Valyrian army spread across the valley below, like a living tapestry of steel and determination. 30,000 soldiers had marched through the night, their banners snapping in the mountain wind, their formation speaking of disciplined purpose rather than chaotic aggression. They're not positioning for siege, Calder observed, his strategic mind reading the patterns of deployment with practiced ease. This is a demonstration of strength, not preparation for assault. They want to negotiate from a position of power. Liana nodded, her eyes fixed on the familiar blue and silver banners that had once flown over her childhood home. They've come to bring their princess home. The question is whether they'll accept the princess I've become rather than demanding the child they lost. Behind them on the battlements, the defenders of Drakmor prepared for whatever might come. King Aldrich had spent the night in urgent consultation with his advisors, weighing the options available to a mountain kingdom facing forces they couldn't hope to defeat through military might alone. The decision to allow Liana to address both armies from the castle walls had been reached only after hours of debate that sometimes approached shouting. A white banner appeared among the Valyrian ranks, and a small party began riding toward the castle under the traditional flag of parley. Even at distance, Liana could make out the distinctive armor of Valyrian nobles, the proud bearing of people who had spent 17 years searching for their lost heir. "Your Highness," came a voice from behind them. Princess Serafina approached, with a small wooden box in her hands, her expression mixing excitement with apprehension. "I've brought something that might help with what comes next." She opened the box to reveal a circlet of silver and sapphires, not the heavy crown of a ruling monarch, but the more delicate diadem traditionally worn by Valyrian princesses. The craftsmanship was exquisite, each sapphire cut to catch light, like captured starlight. The silver worked into patterns that spoke of ancient traditions and royal heritage. "Where did you find this?" Liana asked, her voice soft with wonder as she recognized the piece from portrait galleries in her recovered memories. "It was among your mother's effects, brought here with you as a baby," Serafina explained. "Cook. Marta has been keeping it safe all these years. waiting for the day when you might need to remember who you really are. As Serafina placed the circlet on Liana's dark hair, the transformation was complete. The servant girl who had scrubbed floors and endured beatings was gone, replaced by a princess who carried herself with the natural authority of someone born to rule. But her eyes remained kind, her bearing accessible rather than remote. She had learned compassion in ways that no royal education could have taught. The parley party reached the castle gates, and their leader called up to the battlements in a voice that carried clearly across the morning air. "I am Lord Commander Thane of Valeria, speaking for the rightful government of our kingdom. We understand that Princess Liana may be within these walls. We come not as conquerors, but as subjects seeking our rightful queen." Liana stepped forward to the very edge of the battlements, her blue silk gown and silver circlet making her instantly recognizable as nobility. When she spoke, her voice carried the clear authority of someone who had found her strength through suffering. "I am Princess Liana of Valeria," she called down, her words echoing off the castle walls and across the valley. "Daughter of Marcus, and Elena, heir to the throne that was stolen by treachery and murder. I stand before you not as a captive to be rescued, but as a woman who has found her voice and chosen her path." The reaction from the Valerian forces was immediate and emotional. Soldiers who had spent nearly 2 decades searching for their lost princess fell to their knees, and the sound of 30,000 voices calling her name rolled across the valley like thunder. But Liana raised her hand for silence, and gradually the tumult subsided. "I am grateful to my people for their loyalty and their search. But I must tell you that I stand here not as a princess stolen from her kingdom, but as a woman who has found love and purpose in unexpected places." She turned to take Prince Calder's hand, her gesture visible to both armies and loaded with symbolic meaning. "I propose an alliance between Valeria and Drakmor, sealed by marriage between their royal houses. Let our kingdoms be united not through conquest but through love, not through fear but through mutual respect and shared prosperity." From her other hand, she raised the war banner she had embroidered, its intricate patterns combining the symbols of both kingdoms in designs that spoke of harmony rather than dominance. "This is my vision for our future. 2 realms working together to create something stronger and more beautiful than either could achieve alone." Lord Commander Thane, clearly struggling with the unexpected turn of events, called up to her again. "Your Highness, you speak of marriage and alliance, but the laws of Valeria require the crown princess to marry with the approval of the noble council. Prince Calder is unknown to us, and his suitability as a consort must be evaluated according to our traditions." It was Prince Calder who answered, his scarred face set with determination as he stepped beside Liana at the battlefront. "Then let me prove my worth in the manner your traditions recognize. I challenge any champion you choose to name to single combat, with Princess Liana's freedom to choose her own path as the stakes." The proposal sent ripples of excitement through both armies. Single combat to determine royal marriage rights was an ancient tradition, rarely invoked but still legally binding under the old laws that governed noble houses. It was a solution that honored both kingdoms' customs while providing a clear path forward. But before Lord Commander Thane could respond, a new complication emerged from an unexpected source. Lord Vex, who had been conspicuously absent from the battlements, now appeared leading a small force of castle guards, his face twisted with the desperate fury of someone whose carefully laid plans were crumbling around him. "Seize the pretender!" he shouted, pointing at Liana with a hand that shook with rage. "She has bewitched Prince Calder and corrupted Princess Serafina. She seeks to deliver our kingdom into foreign hands through treachery and lies." The confrontation that followed would determine not just the fate of 2 individuals in love, but the future of both kingdoms and the thousands of people whose lives hung in the balance of decisions made on castle battlements as the morning sun climbed higher in the mountain sky. 6 months later, the great cathedral of Drakmor had been transformed into something that seemed to capture sunlight and hold it prisoner among its ancient stones. Tapestries hung from every wall, not the faded, dusty relics that had decorated the space for centuries, but vibrant new works that told stories of love conquering division, of beauty arising from the ashes of conflict, of two kingdoms learning to dance together instead of fighting. The masterpiece that drew every eye hung behind the altar where Princess Liana and Prince Calder would soon exchange vows. Worked in threads that seemed to glow with their own light, the wedding tapestry told their complete story, from the first blood-stained handkerchief embroidered in a dungeon cell to the moment when a lost princess chose love over safety, alliance over exile. The needlework showed their journey in panels that flowed seamlessly into each other. A servant girl discovering her worth through the eyes of someone who saw past her silence. A scarred prince learning that love could heal wounds deeper than flesh. Two kingdoms putting aside generations of suspicion to build something beautiful together. But the central panel, worked in silver and gold threads that caught the cathedral light like captured stars, showed two hands reaching across a divide, one marked with the honest calluses of work, the other bearing scars that had become beautiful through acceptance, their fingers intertwining to form a bridge that spanned any difference. "It's magnificent," Princess Serafina whispered to cook Marta as they watched the final preparations. Both women had tears in their eyes. Serafina, because she was witnessing a love story that had restored her faith in happy endings. Marta, because the servant girl she had protected for so many years was about to become a queen. The political resolution had been less dramatic, but no less satisfying than the personal one. Lord Vex's attempt to seize Liana on the battlements had backfired spectacularly when his own guards refused to obey orders that would have started a war. His subsequent trial for treason had revealed a web of corruption and secret dealing with foreign powers that explained much about Drakmore's recent difficulties. He now resided in a comfortable exile that kept him far from any position where he could cause further harm. Matron Grell had faced justice of a different sort. Rather than imprisonment, she had been assigned to work under Cook Marta's supervision, learning to show kindness to those she had once tormented. The lesson in humility was proving more effective than any punishment could have been. The single combat that Prince Calder had proposed never took place. When Lord Commander Thane witnessed Calder's decisive action against Lord Vex's rebellion, when he saw how the scarred prince fought not for personal glory but to protect those he loved, the Valyrian noble declared that any man worthy of their princess's love was worthy of their respect. The negotiations that followed had lasted for weeks, but they had been conducted in the spirit of celebration rather than suspicion. Two kingdoms that had spent years viewing each other as threats discovered they had much to offer each other. Drakmore's mountain fortresses and Valyria's fertile valleys. Drakmore's strategic position and Valyria's trade networks. Drakmore's military expertise and Valyria's diplomatic experience. The alliance was formalized not just through marriage but through trade agreements, mutual defense pacts, and cultural exchanges that would enrich both realms for generations to come. Princess Liana would rule Valyria with Prince Calder as her consort, but they would spend half their time at Drakmore, ensuring that the bonds between the kingdoms remained personal as well as political. As the cathedral bells began to ring, announcing the arrival of the wedding guests, Liana stood in a small chamber behind the altar, wearing a gown that seemed to have been woven from moonlight and dreams. The dress had been created by seamstresses from both kingdoms working together, their combined skills producing something more beautiful than either could have achieved alone. Cook Marta entered the chamber carrying a small bouquet of mountain flowers mixed with Valyrian roses, their different origins somehow complementing each other perfectly. "You look like the princess you were always meant to be," she said, her voice thick with maternal pride. "I look like the woman Prince Calder helped me become," Liana replied, her voice now strong and clear, though still capable of the gentle softness that had first attracted him to her embroidered words. "And I feel like the luckiest person in both kingdoms." The ceremony itself was conducted in both languages, with vows that honored the traditions of each realm while creating new promises that belonged uniquely to Lyanna and Calder. When they spoke their commitment to each other, their words echoed off the cathedral stones and seemed to settle into the very foundations of the building, as if the architecture itself was blessing their union. "I promise to see you always as you truly are," Calder said, his scarred hands steady as he placed the wedding ring on her finger. "Not as others expect you to be, not as circumstances try to shape you, but as the extraordinary woman whose heart speaks truths that words cannot express. I promise to love you not despite your scars, but because of the strength they represent," Lyanna replied, her own voice carrying to every corner of the cathedral. "I promise to build with you a kingdom where worth is measured by kindness, where beauty is found in unexpected places, where everyone's voice matters, whether it speaks in words or in silence." When they kissed as husband and wife, the cathedral erupted in celebration that could be heard across both kingdoms. But in the quiet space between their lips and hearts, they shared a moment that belonged only to them. Two people who had found each other in the darkest places and chosen to create light together. The reception that followed lasted for 3 days, with guests from across both realms sharing food, music, and stories that wove new connections between people who had once viewed each other as enemies. Children from Drakmore played games with children from Valeria, their laughter proving that the future could be different from the past if adults were wise enough to choose love over fear. In the years that followed, the story of the mute servant girl who became a queen would be told and retold across many kingdoms, inspiring other lost souls to believe that their worth was not determined by others' limitations, but by their own courage to keep creating beauty in a world that often forgot to value such gifts. And in the royal chambers where Queen Lyanna and King Calder made their home, embroidery frames always held works in progress, tapestries that told new stories of hope and healing, reminders that the most powerful magic in any kingdom was not wielded by sorcerers or armies, but by two people who chose to see the best in each other and build something beautiful together, one careful stitch at a time.